All right. So welcome, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today for our spring lecture series. My name is Katie Worthing, and I'm the Executive Director of the Yarmouth History Center. And it's a real pleasure to welcome you all here today. We're so happy to be hosting this program with Dr. Patrick Burrowes. Just a few points before I formally introduce our speaker. First, we'd like to thank the Leon and Lisa Gorman Fund for their generous support of our lecture series. We also rely on our members and donors to help support events and programs like this. So thank you all to the members and donors who are here. To make sure that we have the best sound quality for today's lecture, please make sure you're on mute during the presentation. We'll have time for questions after the talk. If a question pops into your head during the presentation, feel free to type it into the chat box and we can pose it then if it makes sense, or hold it until the end for further discussion. Just a word for our next Zoom lecture. It will take place on Tuesday, June 15th, also at 4 o'clock. Our speaker for that lecture will be Margaret Gertner, a historic building consultant, and her talk will focus on how to research your old house. So she'll go through tips on looking into deeds, census records, historic maps, and other online resources to help you dig into the kind of biography and history of your house. Now for today's speaker. We're here happy to welcome Dr. Carl Patrick Burrowes, a retired humanities professor and university administrator. He has published extensively on Black press history and antebellum Black emigration to Liberia. From 1995 to 1998, he was the Carter G. Woodson Distinguished Professor at Marshall University. His research has received awards from the International Communication Association and the Association for Education in Journalism and Mass Communications. He holds a PhD in communications from Temple University. Welcome, Patrick. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Katie. Appreciate the invitation. Yes, and so should I start here?
Yep, I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen here. There we go.
So I want to start with a bit of revelation about myself. I actually see dead people, you know, as was the theme of a movie some time ago. But I don't just see them, you know, I interact with them. I spend a lot of my time with them. There are times when members of the family think I'm possessed with subjects from 100 years or more ago. And so it has been with Brown Russwurm. I think I first met Russwurm when I was an undergrad and I was doing a class on Black press history. But he didn't form a really strong impression. And then I got to work on someone who had replaced him as the editor of a newspaper in Liberia. And that person is Hilary Teague, who actually worked as his assistant. And so as I was doing a book on Teague, I discovered Russwurm again. And it's been a wonderful journey. So the book on Teague is done, it's published, and then I got started on investigating Russwurm's story. And I'm hoping, you know, a book is going to come out of that as well. But along the way, it took me to Maine, it took me to Portland, Yarmouth. And the couple that now owns the house that he lived in, one of the houses he lived in Portland, was kind enough to let me in. And it's a wonderful experience to kind of occupy the space that the person you're researching actually once walked around and slept in, etc. So that led me to my love affair with Portland, Maine. And I know as I'm saying this, people from Maine are thinking, yeah, he's pandering. But if any of my children are on here or any member of the families on here, they can tell you that it's my all-time favorite, you know, part of the country. And I look forward to coming up this summer, spending some time there as well. There's something just about the independence, you know, of people out there, the retention of the culture, whereas in most parts of the US, things have become homogenized and overly commercialized, but I hope that hasn't been lost. So Russwurm, John Russwurm was born in 1799 in Jamaica, and then ended up doing a kind of a circuitous journey around the rim of the Atlantic. But what a lot of people don't know, who know his story, what they don't know is that he actually spent his formative years in Maine. And that's what this presentation is about. Next slide, Katie, please. So by the time Russwurm left the US for Liberia, here are a few of the accomplishments, a few of his accomplishments. One, he graduated from Baldwin College in 1826, which is in Maine. That made him the second Black college grad in the US. For several years, it was thought that he was the first, but it was discovered some time ago that there was someone who beat him to it by a couple of weeks. And then he went on to found Freedom's Journal, which was the first Black newspaper in the US, and that was in 1826. Next slide. So before we actually get into the story, I wanted to pose a riddle to you. The riddle says, I have 9 children, my wife has 11, but 13 all counted. There are 4 sons, none are full brothers. Can you unravel that riddle? Okay, if not, that's okay. We'll get to the answer a little later. Next, please. So one of the things about Russwurm that's most striking is he actually was a sort of citizen of the Atlantic world. He was born in Jamaica, the island of Jamaica. His father was a white American. His mother was a Black Jamaican woman. His father sent him to school in Quebec. His father then retired to Portland, Maine, from Portland, Jamaica, coincidentally. And it seems as if the father's move to Maine was due to his being ill. He wanted to recover his health. So he moves to Maine, gets married, and as his illness worsens, he tells his new wife that he has a son in Quebec who's mixed race, and he wants the boy to join the family. She agrees, and John then moves to Portland, Maine, and becomes a part of that family. He goes on to teach in Philly, New York, and Boston. He then serves as editor in New York for a while, and he ends up in Liberia, where he served for the longest time as governor of one of the colonies in Liberia. And so that's the character, of this person. He wasn't a citizen of Jamaica. He wasn't a citizen of the US when he lived there. Citizenship wasn't open to most Blacks at that time. And that's why when I say he was a citizen of the Atlantic world, it was because he kind of embraced all of it. Next, please. So here's a little bit about his parents. His father, the first record I have of his father's existence, he was serving in Portland, Jamaica in 1806 as what was called an attorney. But the word had multiple meanings at the time, and it could have applied to someone who was a manager. You had a lot of absentee property owners, plantation owners in Jamaica, and they would appoint someone to manage the property in their absence. and that person was legally empowered, sort of had a power of attorney to act on their behalf. And so we know that the attorney could have meant a lawyer, it could have meant a manager in that context. But I also found out that he was a merchant. And he then moves a few years later to Portland. About John Russwurm's mother, we know less. I have references to her from people in John's family that say, one, she was Creole. Someone else referred to her as a colored lady from a very respectable family, she said. And a third person said John's father had connected with her because that was the only way he could have controlled property in Jamaica. All of these references are kind of opaque, difficult to interpret because they're open to multiple, interpretations. Creole, for example, could mean many things, and we can come back to that if you like. But the main point I want to leave with you is that if you look at a number of articles that have been written about John Russwurm, scholarly and otherwise, people will refer to his mother as a Black Jamaican, and oftentimes they will immediately assume that she was a slave. And there's no record that she was. So it's important, in doing this kind of research, that we not make those kinds of leaps, those assumptions. And in her case, I think the evidence is clear that she wasn't. Next slide. So John R. Russwurm, the father, moved to Maine. And like I said, it seems as if he was ill at the time, but he lands in Portland and becomes engaged as a merchant. This suggests that he was already a merchant in Jamaica. He might have been involved in an import-export, arrangement with partners in Portland, Maine. But he lands and he's off and running. He acquired a 75-acre property in a section called Back Cove, and the property ran from Ocean Street to Morrow's Corner. I'm dropping these details in for people who are resident, of Portland or Yarmouth, and will be familiar with those landmarks. John's father married Susanna Waterford in 1813. She was a widow with 3 children already. And then she and John R. Russwurm had a son, the only child they had together, Francis Edward, who was born in 1814. Next. So here is the Russwurm family home on Ocean Avenue. I was able to visit. The couple that owned the house when I was there were really very gracious. They allowed me to tour the place. I went into all, crannies and corners. And as you can see from the outside, the owner was substantially well off. And it's reflected on the interior as well. For example, a minor detail, in the living quarters, the living room, those areas where you would have entertained visitors, the knobs on the doors were ceramic. And that's in part because people wanted to show to the outside world, to those who would come to visit them, the best of what they had. But if you stepped on the inside, in the private spaces, on the opposite side of the same door, the handles were not that fancy. And so where they could afford to, they just had this extra touch, to the ornaments of the house. Thanks, Kathy. Next, please. So we switched now from the father to the son. John Brown Russwurm was the son. While he was in Jamaica, he was known as John Brown, period, no Russwurm. And so his connection to the father during that period was being hidden. We don't know why. But the father obviously had a close relationship with his son. Certainly, claimed his paternity by 1807, by the time John was about 7 years old, because he saw to it that John Brown was sent to Canada to school. And he went to an area of Quebec that was quite liberal, was renowned for its sort of abolitionist tradition. And he still didn't have the Russwurm name. The father confesses to Susan he has this son. He wants the boy to join the family. She agrees, and she turns out to be a remarkable mother, precisely what John wanted. His mother had died when he was fairly young. And so John arrives in Maine, John the son, sometime in 1814 or 1815. It's not really clear. Shortly after he arrives, a few months after, his father dies in April 1815. I would like you to pause here and just consider this. Imagine yourself by then about 14 years old. You've been shuttled. Your mom died when you're young. You've been shuttled off to Canada by your dad. He then brings you to Maine. And soon after you arrive, he dies. And now you're in a house with strangers and in a strange place. And now we can move to the next slide. So I'm quoting Susan Russwurm, John's stepmother. It was fortunate that I was able to find some wonderful records. When John Brown died, his stepmom was still alive, and she was asked to write a kind of obituary and to include some of her recollections. And her memory was just vivid, even at a stage in her life where she was quite old. Then John's stepsister also wrote and published her recollections of the family. So those proved to be very important. But Susan remembers that her husband had left the son entirely in her care with a small legacy, which she intended that he would use to finish his education. But the estate that John Sr. had left languished in court from 1815 to 1818. And in the meantime, John is left in limbo, unable to continue school. Next, please. So at this point, John is something of an orphan. I mean, his natural parents are gone. Susan is welcoming, she's supportive, but he realizes that, the funds his father had intended him to receive hadn't come. He's not sure when they will. The case is the estate is being contested. So he leaves for Jamaica, hoping that he can connect with some of his father's former business partners and friends. And he tells his stepmom before he leaves, if I was a white boy, I would never have to leave. His impression was the estate is being contested and tied up in part because some of the inheritance was intended for him. Susan also remembers the sorrow John expressed as he was parting with her children, especially his infant brother, who was the brother that he shared. They shared the same father. Yes. Next, please. So John's father dies. He goes to Jamaica. Susan gets remarried. This is her third marriage. And she marries a widower, William Hawes, who already had 2 children. They got married in May 1817. And together, eventually, they had 6 children of their own. So after they get married, Susan gets word that people have cited John, the son, in some part of Portland. And it's a section where a number of African Americans lived. She sends word that she wants him to come back home. She wants him to join the family. But he makes it clear that he needs an invitation to come from William Hawes, her new husband, because he kind of senses that it would be okay with her, but he didn't know the new husband. He wanted to make sure it would be. And William sends word, and then John comes to join the family. So at that point, William is working at a paper mill on the Royal River. Next, please. So here we get to the answer to that riddle. The riddle was actually used by William Hawes. It was said that he would recite that, to a number of acquaintances, co-workers. And so if you take the number of children in that household, there were a total of 13. 3 were Susan's kids before she married Russwurm. 1 was Francis, who was the child of John Russwurm and Susan. 1 was John Brown Russwurm, who was brought into the family by his father. 2 were children William had by his first wife. 6 were the children, the Hawes children that Susan and William had together. So they equal 13. And as the riddle suggested, there were 4 boys in the family, but none of them shared the same 2 parents. Interesting combination. But according to Sarah, one of John's stepsisters, she said, all lived as one family, pleasantly with each other. I never heard father or mother to strike one of the children. A mild reproof was the only punishment. Yeah, I would say that from my reading of the literature from that period, the parents were unusually lenient or, not engaged in the use of the kinds of punishment that were more common in many households. Next, please. So the owner of the paper mill where William Hawes worked was Calvin Stockbridge. With John back in the family, the estate in dispute, he's approached by Susan and William Hawes to act as John's guardian. He agrees. The Stockbridge family dates back to the Mayflower, like the very first immigrants to the US from Europe, from UK. And he was co-owner of a paper mill with his brother. He was a strong and prominent Baptist, and there are members of his family who say he was more focused on church affairs than he was on business affairs. So his brother ran the business, and he was, a pillar of the Baptist church. He served as North Yarmouth's delegate to the Maine Convention in 1819, when Maine was preparing to break away from Massachusetts. He was a member of the Casco Lodge of Masons in 1821, and William Hawes was also a member. Next, please. So now we cover John from age 19 to 24. He enters Hebron Academy in 1819. It was a college prep school. They taught Greek and Latin, which were foundational if people wanted to go to college. But no sooner did he enter the school when it was destroyed by fire. And so John suffers another setback. And while the family is trying to locate a school that he could attend, it's suggested that perhaps he should go to another city and find a teaching position for a while. It's clear that he already had a somewhat liberal education, although I wasn't able to find a record of the details of it. So he goes down to Philadelphia and he teaches at the Augustine Society School, which was formed by African Americans and self-sustaining. And he taught there very briefly in 1820. I know his time there was brief because I found notices in a Philadelphia newspaper that there were letters waiting for John Russwurm at the post office that had not been delivered. And apparently he was no longer in town. So he moves to New York and he begins teaching at the African Free School in New York. That's a school for Black children. It was sponsored in part by the Presbyterian Church of New Jersey, New York. And there were supporters from the Princeton Theological Seminary in Princeton. A year later, he moves to the African school in Boston. And the person who had served as principal of the Augustine School in Philly, Prince Saunders, was now in Boston and affiliated with the African school there. So again, there are no records that make this point directly, but I think from circumstantial evidence, it would suggest that their earlier connection is what brought John to Boston. And he thrived there, but made lots of important connections, but then eventually he moves back to Maine. Next slide, thank you. And so he moves back to Maine and he gets what he always had wanted, and that is to further his education. He ends up in college for 2 years, 1824 to 1826. The curriculum included solid geometry, Latin, Greek, philosophy. There were prayers and recitations before breakfast. And his schoolmates, who were in a class ahead of him, included Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, the poet, and Franklin Pierce, who becomes US president eventually. So one of Russwurm's classmates was Horatio Bridge, who ends up as a naval officer. And coincidentally, he actually was assigned to a naval ship, a US naval ship that toured the coast of West Africa. And while he was there, he reconnected with John, who was then governor of a colony called Maryland in Africa. So according to Bridge, he said John lived at a carpenter's house just beyond the village limits. And he says that he and Nathaniel Hawthorne, Bridge and Hawthorne were close friends. Hawthorne ends up writing, as many of you who are familiar with American literature would know, Hawthorne was a writer of, I would say, Gothic novels, I guess. But he ends up writing a biography of Horatio Bridge, his friend. And so Bridge says that the two of them would visit Russwurm from time to time, but because of his sensitivity on account of his color, he wouldn't return the calls. The phrasing here is awkward. It might suggest that Russwurm was overly sensitive, but if Bridge and Hawthorne hadn't walked in his shoes, they may not have been able to understand why he might not have been willing to return, the calls that they had extended. Next. So finally, in 1826, comes the day that he had longed for, and it's commencement. He's selected to present one of the commencement speeches. An arrow at the top points to that he's graduating, and the arrow at the bottom shows his place in the order of exercises. It is said in one of the newspaper accounts of the event that the beauty and fashion, prejudice and power of Maine were all present on that occasion. Russwurm chose to speak on the condition and prospects of Haiti. And that was a very risky, bold topic to select because the Haitian Revolution had set off panic across the US, especially in the South. But he chose the topic in part because he was considering emigrating to Haiti. It is said that before he started his address, he was nervous, but he shifted to quote, a full and manly tone with appropriate gestures. Extracts from his address were published in at least 8 newspapers, and it just helped to spread the reputation of this young man who had chosen that controversial topic, and secondly, who was one of the very first people of color to graduate from an American university. Next, please. So after graduating, he moves to New York, and he joins forces with someone he'd known for a few years. It was the Reverend Samuel Cornish, Black Presbyterian cleric. They had worked together at the Augustine School in New York. They worked together at the African Free School in New York. They had worked together at the Augustine School, in Philly. They worked together at the African Free School in New York. So they now joined to launch Freedom Journal, the very first Black newspaper in the US. And in the first issue, there's an editorial written by Russwurm, which says, "We wish to plead our own cause. Too long have others spoken for us. Too long has the public been deceived by misrepresentations in things which concern us dearly." Shortly after Cornish resigned as co-editor of the paper, he said he wanted to recover his health. He moved to a rural part of New York, and Russwurm was left to run the paper alone. Next slide, thanks. And in 1829, the paper is shuttered. Russwurm announces that he's decided to leave for Liberia. He says he had done a lot of investigation, written different people, followed the news coming out of this colony in West Africa. And he said he thought that there we may not only feel as men, but we may act as such. And the concern was all about citizenship, feeling that one had the freedom of speech, the right to vote, all of what comes with that standing. He reminded the audience of Freedom's Journal that he deplored racial prejudices in America as much as any man, he said, but, quote, they are not of our creating and they are not in our power to remove. Think about that. I mean, that was in 1829, and we are now in 2021. Next slide. And so the colony that Russwurm moved to was founded in 1821 by the American Colonization Society. And next year will be the 200th anniversary of its founding. It was a mix of indigenous Africans, US repatriates, people of African descent who opted to leave the US, along with captives who had been liberated from slave ships. So the British outlawed the slave trade. Around 1810, they sent naval ships to Freetown, which was near Liberia, and they began intercepting slave ships. The US Navy then sent a squadron to do the same. And as ships were intercepted, some captives were placed in Freetown. Most of them went to Freetown. Some were landed in Liberia. They were from the Congo, Angola, Nigeria, mainly, and then some other parts of Africa as well. In 1847, the Liberians declared their independence. At that point, Liberia consisted of 11 towns, period. And over the years, it grew and grew and encompassed other territories, up to 43,000 square miles. Next. Russwurm moves to Liberia, and he founds the Liberia Herald in 1830, the first newspaper in Liberia. So he becomes the father of the Liberian press. He served as secretary to the Liberia colony, which made him an employee of the ACS. And in 1836, he was recommended to serve as the governor of one of the colonies. That colony was sponsored by the Maryland Colonization Society. And the recommendation of Russwurm as governor made him the first Black governor of any of the colonies established on the coast of West Africa. The person who made that recommendation was a graduate of Baldwin College who had known him through that connection. After he became governor, he served from 1836 to his death in 1851. Next. So my emojis didn't translate from my iPhone, but what I was saying is the first is a me-emoji, and it's my image. The second is love. The heart should have been red. And the third were my palms touching each other, hands expressing thank you, but it didn't come across. But thank you, thank you, thank you. I'm glad you're present. Thanks for taking time to attend. I look forward to your questions. And I just want to share the URL address for where you can get copies of my books. I don't have a book on Russwurm just yet, but stay tuned. And some of the books are listed here. I offer a 20% discount to those of you who are attending, and I can do autographed copies if you order from knowyourself.press. Otherwise, the books are also available on Amazon. All right, well, thanks, and I'm ready for your questions.
Yeah, I'll just pipe in and say thank you so much for that fascinating presentation. I hope we have some great questions. If you're feeling brave and want to just raise your hand or ask, please do. Otherwise, type it in the chat box.
Thanks.
Katie, can you hear me?
Yep, go ahead.
Professor Burrowes, welcome to Maine. Today it's in the 70s, low humidity, all
Oh,
the fruit trees
my.
are in bloom. We're asking you to come visit.
Oh my.
I
Yes.
serve as the archivist and historian for North Yarmouth Academy, which is actually in Yarmouth, Maine. I had hoped to get to you some work we had done on the Hawes House in Yarmouth, which is now the Merrill Lower School for North Yarmouth Academy. In particular, I thought it was interesting that not only did two of John Brown Russwurm's children attend NYA, although they were sent to the competing academy, Yarmouth Institute, but Sarah made the decision they would go to NYA.
Yes.
But in addition, hold on just a second, let me find my note here, but also the children of Joseph Jenkins Roberts, the first president of Liberia, also attended NYA and also lived with John Brown's stepmother here in Yarmouth. So I thought that might be of interest to you.
Oh, fascinating.
If anyone would like a copy of this brochure I wrote on this whole thing, if they were to contact archives@nya.org, I will send it to them. And thank you for your talk. Very much enjoyed.
Thank you so much. And I definitely will follow up with you. I'm most interested. I should tell you that the Russwurm family name has disappeared from Liberia. I suspect that his sons may have stayed in the US, after he died. But they could have died out as well. There were all kinds of tropical diseases that we didn't have medicines for at the time. And, but it's a mystery, the name doesn't exist.
They may have dotted out, as they say, too. Maybe they just had strong women.
Yeah, but I'm curious and I'm interested in tracing them if possible. And also in learning more about some of the family names that I mentioned, like the Stockbridge family and the Hawes, if any of the descendants are still in the area.
Please contact me. I'll help.
Thanks. Appreciate it.
All right, we have a question on chat from Dugan Murphy, who asks, are you familiar at all with Portland writer and critic John Neal's involvement with the American Colonization Society?
I read a little about that connection. I haven't, done much with it, but I am aware. And what's fascinating is that Calvin Stockbridge, John's guardian when he was an adolescent, actually visited with a mariner in Massachusetts named Paul Coffey. Coffey was a very successful whaler, trader. He owned a couple of ships, African-American, Native American mix background. And Coffey had launched an effort to resettle some African-Americans in Sierra Leone, in Freetown. That was before the American Colonization Society was founded. So Stockbridge travels down to Mass to meet with Coffey and share with him that there are people of African descent in Maine who are interested in participating in this effort. My surmise is that for Stockbridge, his interest was religious. Because he was such a pillar of the church, he was probably interested in sponsoring those who could go in order to evangelize, right? But nonetheless, I found records at the museum in New Bedford, where Paul Coffey lived, of their correspondence between the two. So that was before the ACS was actually formed, and Stockbridge was already participating in conversations regarding African Americans immigrating to Africa.
Let's see, a couple more comments in the chat. Link Merrill says that Joseph Sherman, preceptor at NYA for 6 years, was Russwurm's classmate at Bowdoin.
Who was this?
Joseph Sherman, who was preceptor at NYA for 6 years, was Russwurm's classmate at Bowdoin.
I see. Yes.
And let's see, Seward Cooper points out that in Cape Palmas, Liberia is a monument of Russwurm and an island named Russwurm Island, which is fascinating.
Yes, that's right. Mhm.
Let's see, other folks weighing in to say thank you for the great presentation. Any other questions from anyone in the audience? Oh, here's one. At the beginning of your talk, you mentioned his Creole mother and that we might go back to that term. Would you elaborate? That's from Elizabeth Hope.
So yes, so the term Creole had multiple meanings at the time. One was that this person was mixed. And, you know, race is socially constructed in a variety of ways, depending on the environment. So the way in which, you know, race is defined in Brazil, for example, is different from the US and different from the Caribbean. In Jamaica, there's a tendency to distinguish between people who are dark complexion, those who are light and are considered brown, and then those who are white, you know, Jamaicans. And Creole would sometimes, you know, be used as a reference to people who simply happen to be mixed. But then there was oftentimes an association, an alternative meaning would be an association with Portuguese or Spanish ancestry. So in English-speaking areas, a person who was partly Spanish or Portuguese and Black would be referred to as Creole to an extent that would not be applied to people who were mixed, English-speaking whites and Blacks. So it's an intriguing reference. Of course, there were also in Haiti, there was in Haiti the tendency to refer to mixed race people as Creole. And the last meaning would be those who were second generation or more in the Caribbean. Whereas folks who had just arrived from Africa were considered Africans. And then after they had been there, you know, their children would become Creole. They meant that they had been socialized in that environment. So it's a tricky concept with multiple meanings. But the fact that it suggested that she had property, Russwurm's father gained access to real estate through her, seems to me that she was mixed race. One parent was white, and that through that parent she had access to property.
Let's see, what have you learned about Russwurm's wife?
Oh, Russwurm's wife was a McGill. Her father was a businessman in Baltimore, Black businessman, and he did multiple things, very entrepreneurial. His wife served a white owner who was blind, and this woman manumitted Mrs. McGill, freed her, and gave her inheritance. And so that provided the family an economic boost. George, the father, became interested in emigrating to Haiti. He actually was one of the founders of a Haitian Immigration Association in Baltimore. And he led a group to Haiti to investigate conditions in preparation, you know, to move down to Haiti. He invited Russwurm, John, down to Baltimore because he knew that John had spoken about Haiti and was interested himself in moving to Haiti. So John went to Baltimore, visited with the association. When McGill came back from Haiti, decided not to go, to move. For many African Americans, the fact that French was the national language was a turnoff. The fact that most African Americans were Protestant, Haiti, those who were Christians in Haiti were mostly Catholic, was another turnoff. But we don't know exactly why McGill decided not to. But he ended up immigrating to Liberia instead. And he went a few years before John did. And so the two men who had known each other in the US end up in Liberia, and McGill headed the school system in the colony for a bit, and then they moved to Maryland in Africa, the colony that John became the governor of, and he marries McGill's daughter. So there are a couple of images of the McGill family at the website of the Library of Congress. There was a daguerreotypist, which daguerreotyping was a precursor to photography. So there was an African-American daguerreotypist who moved from New England to Liberia, took his equipment, and he made images of some members of the McGill family. And John's wife is among them.
See, another question here in the chat. Are there any interesting stories you're aware of regarding the Portland Auxiliary of the American Colonization Society?
Not really. Yeah, not really. I will say this though, that early in the life of the American Colonization Society, it received a bad rap, I would argue. There was contention among anti-slavery advocates, activists, and the immediate abolitionists portrayed the ACS as being controlled by Southern slaveholders, and that image stuck. There were people who made that association fairly easy, because Henry Clay was an officer of the ACS. He was a prominent politician, and there were a couple of others like that. So in the public's mind, it was easy for that to stick. But the point I'm trying to make is, and I'm working on a paper right now, almost finished, to be sent for publication. The reality is that the earliest commitment to African repatriation grew out of New England, and it was linked to the New Divinity clerics. And so there are a long list of New Divinity clerics from New England, particularly Connecticut, but many of the other states, who supported African Americans going to Africa by choice. They were not deportationists. And their interest partly was in those who went to Africa being involved in evangelizing. So they were providing support for that. But the manager of the American Colonization Society, Ralph Gurley, was from Connecticut. And all of the governors of Liberia during the colonial period, before Liberians declared their independence, none of them were from the Deep South. Almost all of them were from New England, except for two who were from Maryland. And even the two from Maryland, one had spent his childhood in New England. So there's an interesting connection with New England and the early phase of the African repatriation efforts. That story hasn't been told, it's the half that hasn't been told. But I'm going to be investigating Maine's role in that as well. Yes.
Right. One other comment here from Womi Neal, excuse me if I'm pronouncing that wrong, but John Brown Russwurm was one of the 11 signers of the Declaration of Independence.
Not according to my record. Sorry, Womi, I hate to put a pin in that bubble, because Russwurm had left the colony of Liberia to go to Maryland in Africa, and he was serving there as governor when Liberia declared its independence. But he played a very prominent role in many respects. Yeah.
Any
other
other
comments?
questions?
Yes, this is Jay Robbins again. Professor, Dr. I too am a Bowdoin grad, so I have a double interest here. My understanding is that recently Bowdoin College commissioned a new portrait of John Brown Russwurm that was recently accepted by the college. I don't know if people are aware of that, but It's meant to replace the image that every one of us is so familiar with that's been used through the years. But that might be so, I can't verify that, but it might be something to follow up on.
Oh, I definitely will be following up on it. I'll be curious to know what that image is based on. Was it from an earlier engraving or, you know?
I'm not sure.
Yeah.
I don't know.
That's fascinating. One of the interesting things that I've learned, and I think you might, also find fascinating, is that if you go on the internet and do a search for Russwurm, the name, of course, comes out of Germany, but John Brown Russwurm is by far the most famous Russwurm in the world. And that name just comes up and references to his accomplishments, et cetera, above and beyond, all other Russwurms in Germany or outside. So Maine, provided quite a boost for that young man who went on to do so many great things. And Sarah was a major part of it, an amazing woman for that era. And for that reason, it's not surprising that John sent his sons to live with her while they were in school, because she had such a wonderful relationship with her son.
All right, another question here in the chat. Why did Russwurm change his opposition to the ACS establishment in Liberia?
Yeah, fascinating question. And I provide an answer in a paper I did, which was published, which focuses particularly on Russwurm and the colonization society. So when he's graduating college, he's interested in going to Haiti. He co-founds the Freedom's Journal newspaper. That newspaper is in existence for about 2 years. It's part of an ongoing debate about the fate of African Americans, the direction they should take politically and otherwise to achieve citizenship, sovereignty, what have you. And there are some who are in favor of moving to Haiti. There's some who moved to Canada. There were agents of the paper, distributors, living in Haiti and Canada and Liverpool at the time. So it was already a cosmopolitan paper. And one of the approaches, the strategies that was, being considered at the time was the option of Liberia. And Russwurm is part of this discussion. He's inviting people to publish in the paper who are pro-African colonization. There are others who are writing in to oppose that. And at the end, before he closes the paper, he explains himself. And one of the slides included his comments about feeling that in Liberia, we could not only be men, but we could feel like men, we could earn citizenship. And so that's his main motivation. He said that he could not foresee African Americans gaining citizenship without violence. And the violence would be on a massive scale. And it would take a long time for that to happen. It was somewhat prophetic because looking back, you think that he's foretelling the coming of the Civil War several decades later. By the time the Civil War erupts, he's dead. So he had what he wanted in his lifetime. And it came for others later in the US, but he chose not to wait. Other comments, questions? All right.
All right. Well, thank you so much for this fascinating talk. I love these reminders that local history is never really just local. We've spanned the Atlantic here in this talk, which is fascinating. So thank you so much for that. And
Thank you, Katie.
yeah, thank you to everyone who's joined us today. as I said, this talk was recorded, so we'll put it up on our website so you can go back and watch if you missed part of it.
Okay. Appreciate it. Thanks to everyone who showed up. Really appreciate it. And Jay, I look forward to meeting you when I come back up to Maine, and it won't be too long.
Good.
All right. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Take
Bye.
care. Okay.